Organisers of the conference invited me to think about this a bit and to figure out whether it's a positive thing, a negative thing, or whether there's some other explanation that we can look at for it. So from the point of view of an academic doing security research, the move to phones and tablets is really exciting because it shakes up an awful lot of stuff that's been kind of static for the last 30 years or so. On the web alone, suddenly we're redesigning all our websites so that people can watch them on phones, and that's just great. Websites have become so cluttered over the last 15 years with tiny type and flashing stuff and so on. If you're over 40, it's a real pain to read it, isn't it? You upsize 3 times, you can read it, and half the content goes off the side of the screen. That's now being fixed, and that's super. For advertisers, it's a bit of a pain. If you're Google shareholder or Facebook, you'll have seen that last year or the year before there was a bit of a dip in the stock price as Wall Street figured out that there are fewer ads to click on mobile, and so it's not obvious where the revenue is going to come from. So what's the implication for security, though? Well, one of the things we realize is that this potentially completely changes the whole problem with passwords, which has been a pain for at least 30 years. Because with a laptop, you log in whenever you sign in. You put in your Gmail password every day, perhaps more than once a day. But with a phone, you log in at sign up. You buy the phone, you put in your password, and it's sorted. 3 years later, whatever, it gets stolen or you throw it away or whatever, then you get a new one, and then you do it again. And tablets now seem to be going the way of phones. So does this at last solve the password problem? Previously, we had this huge trade-off between security and usability. But if a password is something that you copy in once every year or so, you can keep all your passwords in a big black book, and they can be 20 characters long. Or you can use two-factor authentication, or whatever. So the interesting thing here is, are mechanisms like the Gmail logon and the Facebook logon finally going to give us something that's equivalent to single sign-on, but that works across multiple platforms? And that could be really good in an awful lot of ways, because how the guys who maintain Google Dashboard down in Munich are doing it is that they're doing all the plumbing. If your phone's stolen, not a problem. You go to Dashboard and you hotlist it. And you don't have to change your Gmail password on all your other devices, on your tablet, on your laptop, on your workstation, at your desk, and so on. What other problems can you solve? Well, firstly, nobody checks SSL, so let the browser do the heavy lifting. Let the mechanisms in Chrome take care of that. Next thing is that automated attacks become really, really easy to detect. If you're having authentication done by a huge company that sees 1 billion authentications a day, then if somebody gets your password and starts using it in an internet cafe in Indonesia, it really sticks out like a sore thumb. So that's a big gain. And now we see the FIDO Alliance is trying to standardize all this stuff. So far, you know, it's positive all the way. But there's a whole lot of stuff that still needs fixing: backup, reset, restore, account recovery. And we're beginning to see so much diversity in the platform itself that this brings new issues. And so while mass attacks on systems may become more difficult, targeted attacks on your key execs, your finance director, the man with the money bags, may become easier. So it's complex. Now, one of the things that we can use to try and figure out which direction of travel we're going to have with the technology is by starting to look at the economics. Now, back in the last century, in the 1900s, we had a very traditional view of systems engineering, that you'd build systems for scalability, you choose efficient algorithms and data structures, then you start thinking about consistency, file locking, and so on. You put complexity at the edge of the network where you can, and you see security as keeping the bad guys out by adding things like cryptography and authentication and filtering. Around about 2000, a number of us started to realize that this isn't enough, because as the internet took off, all of a sudden, more and more systems were depending on the selfish behavior of tens of thousands of actors. Think of the global card payment system, for example. 20,000 banks, 20 million merchants, 1 billion cardholders. And hey, all of these guys are behaving selfishly. How do you do governance on that? even if you've got a system run by a single company like Facebook, you know, there's everything in there. There's Israelis and Palestinians having a go at each other, and Sunni and Shia groups, and, you know, all the world's conflicts suddenly migrate into your system. How do you cope with that? Well, what we've been looking at is how you apply economic analysis to security. And the big insight is that systems very often fail because the folks who guard them or who could fix them have insufficient incentives. Now, this is well known in the world of utilities, because if the electricity generation companies who sell electricity to the grid don't have an incentive to provide reserve capacity, then you're going to get blackouts. So when National Grid runs a power auction every day, they put a tax on the winning bids, and they use the tax money to pay for some reserve capacity. But on the internet, we've got no equivalent of that. And we do see some interesting effects. For example, in those countries where it's easy for banks to blame fraud, to charge back fraud, either to cardholders or merchants, they're thereby exposed to less of it, and overall fraud goes up. So in countries like Britain, Spain, South Africa, where the banks are particularly powerful with respect to the regulators, fraud actually goes up. Now, the takeaway message is that insecurity and fragility are often an externality. That is a word that economists use for side effects. And connecting an insecure computer to the internet is a bit like lighting out a wood fire in your garden, right? The smuts end up in your neighbour's washing, and the acid rain is 5 miles downrange, and the CO2, you know, adds to the pool in the atmosphere. Similarly, if you attach an insecure computer to the internet, then the chances are somebody will recruit it to a botnet, and it may do bad things. And those bad things will, of course, usually hurt other people, so you don't care. But nonetheless, it's contributing to degrade the environment we all have to live in. So there's been a whole bunch of work done in the past 15 years on information security economics, which you may care to go and have a look at. There's links from the website, models of what might go wrong, measurements of what has gone wrong, recommendations on who can do what this means for policy, for cybercrime, for net neutrality, dependability, and all the rest of it. But here's one of the key ideas. Our industry is different from other industries because of three things that make us prone to monopolies. We've got high fixed and low marginal costs. It costs very little to sign up one more customer once you've built your infrastructure. We've got network effects. The more people are in a network, the more valuable it is to everybody. And the switching costs. Moving from Alice's product to Bob's product costs you money. And in fact, it turns out, when you run the math, that the value of a software or services company is roughly equal to the lock-in of all the users. So everybody's trying to lock in their users harder, and their competitors are, of course, trying to beat down on this lock-in so that they can liberate some of the users to move to their product instead. How does this cause insecurity? Well, 20 years ago at Redmond, the saying was, ship it Tuesday and get it right by version 3. And this is how you go about building a dominant position in a network market. You get there first, you get the network effects going, you get everybody on board, and then you lock the thing down so that your customers can't escape. And we've seen this again and again and again. The result is products where security is an afterthought and isn't built from the customer's point of view. Same with Facebook. Facebook competing with MySpace, make sure everybody writes their Facebook apps. Android, need one go on. Okay. So now we've got some idea of what might, in principle, go wrong with things like Android. What problems do we see in real life? Well, most Android phones are exploitable. And one of the key reasons for this is that most vendors will only patch the operating system while the device is still on sale, because vendors customize the operating system, and as soon as they stop selling a phone, all their development team gets moved on to the new version that they're about to ship. There's an awful lot of features are ropey. Some of these come from Android and some come from customizations. And in particular, at the beginning of Android, as you would expect from the previous slide, there's definitely a lack of security features. But one thing that's changing round about now is that we're seeing ever more second-hand devices in use. Right? If you go back 5 years or so, everybody would toss their phone after a year or two. Perhaps it would be recycled to a less developed country, but it was not normal for rich people in developed countries to go and buy phones on eBay. Now it is absolutely the norm. There are hundreds of millions of phones out there that have been pre-owned, and this raises a number of issues. If you've got insecure versions of Android, like Gingerbread, they're going to be around for a while. And also, when phones change hands, when your staff sell their phones or buy phones that they're then going to use at work, you've got to start worrying about whether backup and reset and so on actually work. Now, when you think about it, the phone vendors don't have an incentive to make this work properly, and neither do the vendors, neither the network operators. There's one or two firms like Samsung have got a proprietary backup and restore, but the function of that is to see to it that you back up all your data on Mr. Samsung servers in Seoul, so that the next phone you buy will also be a Samsung product. It's not about creating an interoperable ecosystem. So we went out and we studied factory reset and the remote wipe facilities that you get with some AV products. And there will be a paper out shortly, which you can see on my webpage, but here very rapidly is the executive summary. We bought 23 Android phones on eBay. We estimated that something like 340 million devices don't sanitize the data partition properly on reset. That's about a third of the population. I can't give you a sub-second guide to what that is, because it depends heavily on vendor customization. And basically, those phones that use an emulated SD card tend to wipe properly because they can wipe that whole emulated card. When you look at the industry of people who buy and sell phones, the independents and also the services operated by the network operators, almost all of them, in fact all but one of the network operators, tell users to do the sanitization. But you can't sanitize a phone unless you've got a relevant PhD or a large lump of explosive. That's the problem. So here is the opportunity for bent resellers to harvest personal data from phones that they've bought, or to install malware in phones that they resell. There's an interesting question about whether and when that sort of thing might be economic. You might think it might be worth trying if you own a phone shop in Palo Alto, or perhaps in Cheltenham or somewhere like that. But that's for speculation. Stolen phones are another big business. Over 3 million phones are stolen each year in America alone. So what happens when your phone is stolen? Well, about 47% of users lock their phones, so most of them are free to air. Very few people encrypt. Most locks are defeated fairly trivially by stuff you can find online, open bootloaders and so on. So what can you do to protect your company? Well, you can get everybody to install an antivirus app that will enable you to remotely break a phone or remotely wipe a phone if it gets pinched. So we looked at 10 of these, and basically none of them work. Right? Seven of them can be trivially circumvented by removing the admin privileges from the AV app, and the other 3 can be defeated by some of the usual tricks that you can find online. So this is a space where competence is yet to pervade. There are also issues with networks, because the networks still have got an incentive to move people from prepay to contracts to lock them in. So the network, which needs to cooperate to do software update, doesn't have an incentive to do so properly because it prefers dependency. So what can you do? Well, a sensible thing to do is to give all your key employees kit that you can control, certainly key financial officers, developers, and so on. But even if you do this, you can't force it on your customers. So the big takeaway message is that multiple market failures get in the way of making the security of a bring-your-own-device world really tight. So what can we do in practice? Okay, so you know all this stuff, and your CEO is saying, I don't care, I want to save money, I'm going to tell everybody to bring their own phone. Well, the first thing is, if you've got critical functions, such as people who are writing security-critical code, know what platforms they use. Better still, give them laptops and have remote administration from the company so that everything's properly locked down. Really critical functions, well, we had I went to see the 3 guys at Cambridge University who sign off on our bank account. These 3 guys, between them, could go and spend 50 million of our money buying dodgy investments or whatever. And I found to my horror that they were all using almost identical Windows laptops. So I gave them a bit of a talking to about malware, and I said, one of you guys has got to use an iPad. Diversity can make a big difference in some key places, and that's one of the things that you may actually get from a more diverse ecosystem, but you have to manage it. Otherwise, you'll find that herding behavior leaves you vulnerabilities where you last want them. Less critical stuff, clearly you have to think through the costs and benefits of bring your own device versus the morale benefits of giving people a company tablet. If giving somebody a Nexus tablet worth 100 quid is an alternative to giving him a pay rise that costs £1,000. Well, go figure. How does this work in terms of the overall corporate culture? And when you're thinking all this through, you have to think of soft spots such as account recovery. Right? Your Android phones have Gmail accounts with them. You know, who sets the security questions, what mobile phone numbers to the recovery SMSs get sent to. You know, all this stuff has to be worked through. Second piece of practical advice, the biggest soft spot may be your customers. Depends on what kind of business you're in and how you interact with your customers. But we were talking to a number of firms and credit reference agencies who run e-commerce websites, and it turns out that in the UK, a little bit over 4% of the transactions offered at websites, shopping websites, are turned down because of alarms from the fraud engines. So that's a big deal. That's costing serious money. That's sales foregone. If you go to the extent, as many banks do and some other people, of giving all your customers an app with which they can interact with you, then you probably already know that testing apps for 900+ versions of Android is a real pain. And even if you outsource it, it costs you serious money. So what's the best advice here? My suggestion is that you focus on the fraud engine. And from the firms that we talked to, we found that the best results were where the information security function was reporting to the chief marketing officer rather than the chief financial officer. If you report to the chief financial officer, he's some grey bean counter who thinks, oh, you spent 1.7 million on security last year, how can we cut that? Whereas if you go and speak to the chief marketing officer, he says, I want those 4% more sales. How do I do it? There's a completely different attitude that you get if you can suddenly get your backing and get your budget from the guy who's in charge of increasing sales. So that's a brief whistle-stop tour of how a security academic sees the bring-your-own-device world. As much else in security, it's about dealing with externalities. And the scary thing is that we're moving towards a wired world with global scale and distributed harm, where law enforcement doesn't give local incremental benefits. And so most police forces basically give up on cybercrime. So real-life crime goes down, cybercrime goes up. Ministers boast that they're achieving something, but the end. The big questions that you have to ask here is who benefits from systems, who maintains them, and who pays when things go wrong. Now, thinkers who write about this, like Bruce Schneier, say that eventually we may be headed towards different institutions. Bruce figures that we may be headed for a new feudalism, and people will in future have their main log-on and give their primary digital allegiance either to Google or Facebook or Microsoft or Yahoo. Just like if you lived in the Scottish borders 500 years ago, you had to give your allegiance to either the Douglases or the Armstrongs or the Percys to protect you from the others. But from the point of view of a business here and now, such long-term speculation is merely fun. The way forward for firms is to understand now what the risks are of the platforms and also what the incentives are that drives the business of your key suppliers, right? The key suppliers of things like phones, key suppliers of things like platforms, and key suppliers of things like mobile network services. Because that's the best way you can get an insight into the likely direction of travel. And if you want to read more about all this, I've got a security engineering book that you can download completely free from my website.
Great.
Thanks.
Thanks very much for that.